In a small town where the houses were crowded together and the streets smelled of damp and gasoline, there lived a woman named Evelin. She was in her 40s, but she looked older, her face was lined, and her eyes were always red, as if from lack of sleep or tears. She worked at a local eatery, serving greasy burgers and warm cokes while her hands were shaking with fatigue. Evelin wasn't beautiful, and she wasn't smart either, but she had one thing that set her apart from the rest: she could tell stories. Not the kind of fairy tales that are read to children before bedtime, but creepy, viscous stories that made people's fingers go cold and their mouths go dry. The diner's patrons, truckers and local drunks, loved listening to her, especially late at night, when the lights were dimming and shadows were stretching in the corners. Her stories always began the same way, with a quiet, almost whispering description of everyday life. She could talk about how someone went home after work, how the floorboards in the old house creaked, or how meat smelled in the pan. But then, imperceptibly, Evelin's voice became tougher and the details sharper. She talked about missing people, about screams that no one had heard, about bloodstains that were found in backyards. No one knew where she got these stories from. Some joked that she was just making things up, retelling movies or newspaper headlines. Others, those who looked into her eyes a little longer, suspected that Evelin knew more than she was letting on. One evening, a guy named Trevor came into the diner. He was about 25, thin, with disheveled hair and a scar on his chin that he got after falling off a bicycle as a child. Trevor was new to the neighborhood, arrived in an old pickup truck with rusty sides and got a job at a gas station nearby. He was curious, liked to ask questions, and even more, to listen. That night, Evelin sat at the counter, wiping glasses with a crusty cloth and muttering to herself. Trevor ordered coffee, even though it was after midnight, and grinned. "I heard you're a master of horror stories here. Tell me something that will really make me regret that I heard it." Evelin looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether it was worth it. Then she nodded and started talking. She told about a man who lived in a house on the outskirts, lonely, silent, with his hands always stained with something sticky. Neighbors noticed that he often dug holes in the yard, but no one asked why. One night he disappeared, and the next morning a box of yellowed letters was found in his basement. They described things that made Trevor's hair stand on end: how this man watched people, recorded their habits, calculated when they would be alone. Evelin spoke slowly, savoring every word, and ended up saying that the letters weren't written in his handwriting. Trevor left the diner pale, clutching the keys to the pickup truck so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He didn't sleep that night, tossing and turning on the sagging mattress in his rented room and thinking that Evelin might not just be a storyteller. The next day, he returned, ordered the same coffee, and asked for another story. That's how his obsession began. Every night he would come, listen, and then leave, feeling something inside him break. Evelin didn't mind. She talked as if it was her job, as if she needed to talk herself out. After a couple of weeks, Trevor started noticing oddities. Evelin never repeated herself, but there were details in her stories that seemed too vivid. She described the smells: rust, sweat, rotting fruit, so that he could smell them in the air. She knew what skin looked like when it was cut, how bones crunched under a heavy shoe. One day, she mentioned the old gas station where Trevor worked, and the man who supposedly hung around there, looking for lone drivers. Trevor shuddered. He'd seen this guy a couple of days ago, hunched over, with a blank stare, but he hadn't told anyone. From that moment on, Trevor's curiosity was replaced by something else. He began to suspect that Evelin was not making up her stories, but taking them from real life. Maybe she was a witness. Maybe an accomplice. Or worse, she did it all by herself. He began to follow her. He recorded when she left work, where she was going in her old sedan with a cracked window. He even went into her trash can one night and found crumpled pieces of paper with addresses and names, nothing concrete, but enough to make his heart beat faster. Evelin didn't seem to notice his surveillance. Or pretended to. She kept telling me, and each time the stories got darker. She once described how someone tied a man to a chair, poured gasoline on him and set him on fire, just to see how long he would scream. Trevor couldn't stand it. He asked how she knew that. Evelin just smiled, showing her yellow teeth, and said, "People tell me their secrets themselves. You just have to listen." Trevor didn't believe it. He decided to find out the truth. That night, he waited until the diner was empty and hid around the corner, watching Evelin get into the car. He followed her, keeping his distance until her sedan turned onto a dirt road leading to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts. There, among the rusty barrels and overgrown weeds, began something that Trevor would never forget. Trevor turned off the engine of his pickup truck and got out, trying not to slam the door. The night was cold, and the air smelled of earth and something metallic. He saw Evelin parking her sedan at an abandoned warehouse, a long building with a sunken roof and walls covered with peeling paint. She got out of the car without looking back and disappeared inside through the rusty door, which creaked so loudly that Trevor wanted to cover his ears. He waited a few minutes, listening to the sounds, a dog howling in the distance, the wind rustling dry leaves, but there was no sound from the warehouse. That alerted him. Evelin didn't seem like a person who just wandered through abandoned places. He took a flashlight out of the glove compartment, an old one with a dim yellow light, and followed. Glass fragments and small stones crunched underfoot, and every step thudded in his chest. The warehouse door was ajar, and Trevor slipped inside, keeping close to the wall. The smell of mold and something pungent, like solvent or gasoline, hit my nose. The beam of the flashlight picked out piles of garbage from the darkness, old tires, torn sacks, scraps of rope. And then he heard Evelin's voice, low and monotonous, as if she were reading aloud. Trevor moved towards the sound, trying not to breathe too loudly. The warehouse was huge, with partitions made of rotten planks and piles of junk that created a maze. He turned the corner and froze. Evelin stood with her back to him, illuminated by the faint glow of a kerosene lamp that she had placed on an overturned crate. In front of her was a table, roughly made of darkened wood, stained with what looked like rust. But it wasn't rust. Trevor realized this when he saw what she was doing. There was a man lying on the table. A man in his 30s, with dirty blonde hair and a face distorted by pain. His hands and feet were tied to the table with thick straps, the kind used to secure loads in cars. His mouth was covered with gray duct tape, but muffled wheezing came from under it. Evelin was holding a knife in her hands, not a kitchen knife, but a long, serrated blade, the kind you take for fishing or hunting. She took her time, running the tip over the man's skin, leaving thin red lines that immediately began to bleed. Trevor felt his stomach clench and his legs turn to jelly. He wanted to retreat, to run away, but something held him in place. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the same morbid curiosity that had brought him here. Evelin spoke again, and now Trevor realized that she wasn't just mumbling. She described everything she did as in her stories. "At first you feel the cold of the metal," she said softly, almost tenderly. "Then the warmth when it goes deeper. The skin separates easily if you know where to apply pressure. Like that." The knife entered the man's shoulder, and he jerked, letting out a strangled groan. Blood flowed across the table, dripping onto the floor with a thud. Evelin leaned closer, as if studying his reaction, and then pulled out a knife and made another incision, this time along the ribs. Trevor put his hand over his mouth to keep from giving himself away. He could see the man's fingers moving, as he tried to pull away, but the straps held tight. Evelin put down the knife and took something else from the drawer, a metal jar with a cloudy liquid. She unscrewed the lid, and the smell of gasoline became stronger. Trevor remembered one of her stories, about a man who was burned alive. He thought it was fiction. Now he realized that it wasn't. She splashed gasoline on the man's legs. He struggled harder, his eyes widened in horror. Evelin took out a lighter, flicked it, and a small flame lit up her face. Her smile, crooked, with yellow teeth, was the same as in the diner when she finished another story. Trevor couldn't stand it. He took a step back, and his shoe brushed against an empty tin can. The sound reverberated through the warehouse like a gunshot. Evelin whirled around, her eyes finding him in the dark. Time stood still for a second. Then she took a step towards him, still holding the lighter in one hand and the knife in the other. "Trevor," she said calmly, as if she'd met him at the counter. "You shouldn't have come here." He turned around and ran. My heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. He stumbled over debris, fell, got up, feeling the air burn his lungs. Evelin didn't shout at him, didn't chase him, or he just didn't hear her footsteps. He reached the pickup truck, started the engine with trembling hands, and sped away, leaving the warehouse in a cloud of dust. It wasn't until a few miles later that he pulled over to the side of the road, turned off his headlights, and tried to catch his breath. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and the man's wheezing was in his ears. The next day, Trevor did not go to work. He sat in his room, locked the door and checked the lock every half hour. He didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I tell someone? Who would believe that Evelin, that tired waitress with a hoarse voice, would do such a thing? He tried to convince himself that he was mistaken, that it was a dream or a hallucination from exhaustion. But the smell of gasoline and blood still lingered in his mind. In the evening, he heard a knock on the door. Quiet, but persistent. Trevor froze, staring at the handle, which began to turn slowly. He grabbed the first thing that came to hand, a heavy wrench, and came closer. A draft came through the crack under the door, and with it came a familiar, pungent smell, like that night. Gasoline. The door swung open, and Evelin stood there. She was holding a plastic bag with something dark and thick dripping from it. She looked at Trevor and said, "You wanted to know where my stories came from. Now you will be a part of one of them." Trevor stepped back, picking up the key, but Evelin stepped forward faster than he expected. She didn't look strong, but her movements had the confidence of someone who had done it more than once. The bag fell to the floor, and a piece of meat rolled out of it, a human hand, with severed fingers, still fresh, with skin glistening with blood. Trevor screamed, but the sound was cut off when Evelin hit him with something heavy on the back of the head. He woke up later. He didn't know how much time had passed. My head ached, and I tasted iron in my mouth. He was lying on something hard, his arms and legs were not moving. Straps. The ones he saw on the table in the warehouse. Evelin was leaning over him, her face calm, almost bored. She was twirling a knife in her hands, and there was the same can of gasoline next to it. "People love scary stories," she said, looking into his eyes. "But they don't realize how much work they're doing." She started cutting. Slowly at first, over the skin on his chest, then deeper, revealing the muscles. Trevor screamed until his voice cracked, but the warehouse was far away from everyone, and no one heard. Evelin worked methodically, like a butcher separating meat from bones. She took her time, sometimes stopping to wipe the blood off her hands with a cloth that was already red. After a while, she took out a notebook, an old one with a battered cover, and began writing. Trevor saw her writing, heard the pencil scratching on paper. She described his screams, the smell of his blood, the way his fingers were shaking. That was her next story. He lost consciousness and regained consciousness, each time hoping that this was the end. But Evelin didn't let him die quickly. She splashed gasoline on his feet, just like that man, and flicked a lighter. The fire flared up with a hiss, and Trevor felt his skin melt, as pain devoured him from the bottom up. He no longer screamed, he had no strength. Evelin looked at him with her head slightly tilted, as if assessing the result. Then she said, "You were right, Trevor." The fire licked at Trevor's legs, and the pain was such that he could no longer separate the scream from the silence. His body was twitching in the straps, but his mind was clinging to reality like a drowning man to a straw. Evelin stood next to him, watching him with the same calmness with which she wiped glasses in the diner. The flame went out on its own. She didn't let it flare up too much, splashing just a couple handfuls of gasoline on her feet. It wasn't an accident. She wanted him to stay conscious, to feel everything until the end. The smell of burnt leather mixed with the acrid smoke, and Trevor coughed until his throat bled. Evelin put down the lighter and picked up the knife again. She came closer, her boots squeaking on the debris-strewn floor. In the dim light of the lamp, Trevor noticed that her hands were covered with old scars, thin, barely noticeable lines, as if someone had once cut her the same way she was cutting him now. She leaned toward him, and he could feel her breath, sour, with a taste of tobacco and coffee. "Do you know why I'm doing this?" "What is it?" she asked, not looking into his eyes. "Because people pay for fear. Not with money, no. They pay attention. And I give them what they want." Trevor didn't answer, he couldn't. His vocal cords had been ripped off, and his mouth was filled with a mixture of saliva and blood. Evelin didn't wait for an answer. She ran her hand over his arm, opening the skin from the elbow to the wrist, and watched as the blood flowed in thin streams, collecting in a puddle under the table. Then she took a small metal hook, the kind used for butchering fish, and hooked it over the edge of the wound. Trevor jerked, but the straps dug deeper into his wrists, leaving purple marks. She slowly pulled the hook up, tearing the skin from the muscles, and he heard a sound, wet, crisp, like tearing a wet cloth. Her face didn't flinch. She worked with frightening precision, as if she were not a human being, but a piece of meat on a chopping board. At some point, she stopped, wiped her forehead with her sleeve and took out a pack of mints from her pocket. She unwrapped one, put it in her mouth, and began to chew, looking at Trevor. "You're holding up better than most," she said, smacking her lips. They usually shut down faster. Trevor wanted to die. He prayed for it with everything he had left, but his body refused to give up. Evelin went back to work. She picked up a hammer, a heavy one with a handle darkened by age, and aimed it at his knee. The blow was fast and accurate. The crunch of bone echoed off the warehouse walls, and Trevor felt his leg drop below the knee, as if it no longer belonged to him. The pain exploded in his head, but he didn't lose consciousness. Evelin knew how far he could go. She went to the drawer where the lamp was and pulled out a plastic container. Inside were tools, pliers, and a pair of rusty nails. Trevor looked at it blearily as she selected the pliers. She went back to him, grabbed his hand, and pinched the nail on her index finger. One sharp movement, and the nail came off with a wet slurp. Blood splattered on her cheek, but she just blinked and continued, moving on to the next finger. Trevor was no longer screaming, he was wheezing, gasping in pain and terror. The warehouse was quiet, only the sounds of her work broke the silence, crunching, slurping, dripping blood on the floor. Evelin sometimes stopped to write something down in her notebook. She described how his skin darkens from burns, how his muscles contract under the knife, how his eyes glaze over but won't close. It wasn't just cruelty, it was a system. She collected the material like a scientist collects data. After a while, Trevor had lost count of the minutes. She decided to change her approach. She pulled an awl out of the container and held it up to his face. He tried to turn away, but the strap around his neck held his head in place. Evelin put the point against his lower eyelid and pressed, not hard, but enough so that he could feel the metal touching his skin. "People think that fear is darkness or ghosts," she said, leaning so close that he could see the cracks on her lips. "No. Fear is when you know what's going to happen next and you can't do anything." She pressed harder, and the awl entered the eye socket. Trevor heard a sound like grapes bursting, and then half the world disappeared in a white flash of pain. Evelin pulled out the awl, and hot liquid gushed out of the wound, trickling down his cheek. He was twitching, tearing at the straps, but this only increased the pain. She watched him with her head slightly tilted, like an artist evaluating his work. Then she went away and brought a bucket of water. A cold, smelly liquid gushed onto his face, washing away the blood and making him suffocate. Evelin didn't want him to bleed to death. It wasn't the time yet. She took the knife and began a new incision, this time along the abdomen. The skin parted, revealing pink insides, and Trevor felt something warm flowing out of him. Evelin reached inside, digging into his body as if she was looking for something specific. She pulled out a piece, slick, shiny, and dropped it to the floor with a thud. "It's going to be a good story," she muttered, wiping her hands on her pants. They will listen with bated breath. Trevor couldn't think anymore. His mind dissolved into pain, but his body continued to live, clinging to the last remnants of air. Evelin took out a coil of wire and began wrapping it around his neck, not to strangle him, but to keep his head straight. She wanted him to look at her while she worked. At some point, he noticed that she had brought a bag, an old leather one with spots that looked like dried mud. She opened it and pulled out the photos. Dozens of pictures taken on an old Polaroid. There were people on them, men, women, even a teenager with freckles. They all had empty faces, open mouths, and torn bodies. Evelin spread them out on the table next to Trevor, like a collector showing off his trophies. "These are my first works," she said. "You'll be better. You have a character." She took the knife and continued to cut, taking her time now, savoring every move. Trevor could feel the life draining out of him, but Evelin wouldn't let him go completely. She splashed more water and slapped him on the cheek to bring him to his senses. She needed live material. The warehouse became his hell. Time stretched into an endless series of pain, blood, and the sound of her voice reading the notes. She described how his fingers were shaking, how his breathing was getting ragged, how his skin was turning into rags. It wasn't just torture, it was a ritual, creating a story that she would later tell in a diner, looking into the eyes of another curious fool. Trevor didn't know how much longer he could take it. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. Evelin didn't stop. She took out a new tool, a small saw with small teeth, and tried it on his hand. The sound of metal biting into bone was the last thing he heard before consciousness began to slip away. But even then, she didn't let him leave, shaking him and splashing more water. "Stay with me," she said. "The best is yet to come." The saw bit into Trevor's bone with a hideous screech, and he could no longer distinguish the sound from the pain. His hand hung on the thin patches of skin as Evelin methodically separated it from his body. Blood flowed profusely, drenching the table and the floor, but she didn't pay attention. Her hands were used to this mess. Trevor stopped struggling, his mind shattering like glass under a hammer. He looked at her with one surviving eye, and there was no fear in that gaze anymore, only emptiness mixed with something new that he himself could not understand. Evelin put down the saw and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a red mark. She looked at Trevor, slightly tilting her head, and said, "You're not shouting anymore. It's good. Now you understand." He didn't understand. Or he understood too much. His mind, exhausted by pain and blood loss, began to sink into a strange state, not fainting, not death, but something in between. Psychiatrists might call it dissociative disorder, when a person splits up to escape from the unbearable. But for Trevor, it was not salvation, but a fall into the abyss, where he became both a victim and a spectator. He saw himself from the outside, the mutilated body on the table, the stump of an arm, the burned legs, the bloody mess his face had turned into. And he saw Evelin, not as a monster, but as an artist whose work was brutal but meaningful. She noticed the change in his gaze and smiled, the same crooked smile that had once given him goosebumps in the diner. "People think that life is about order," she said, sitting down on a box next to him. Her voice became thoughtful, almost lecturing. "They build houses, start families, and believe that chaos is an exception. But chaos is the foundation. We're all meat, Trevor. Meat that breathes until it is cut. I'm just showing the truth." Trevor didn't answer, he couldn't. His throat was torn by screams, his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. But her words cut into him like a knife into flesh. He began to see the meaning in her actions, and that scared him more than the pain. Evelin took an awl and began to pick out pieces of skin from his chest, continuing to speak. "Suffering is not a punishment. This is liberation. When I cut, I take away the excess. I'm only leaving what's real. You can feel it, right?" He felt it. Not only pain, but also a strange relief. His mind, split apart, clung to her philosophy like a lifeline. Maybe she's right. Maybe life is an illusion that people invented in order not to see the truth. His body was ruined, but something inside him agreed with her. It wasn't just madness, it was a conviction born out of agony. Evelin got up, picked up a hammer, and went to his head. She took her time, taking her time like a sculptor before the final blow. "You're going to be my best story," she said. "Not because you're strong, but because you broke down right." She struck. 1, 2, 3, the hammer smashed into his skull, cracking the bones with a dull crack. But Trevor didn't die right away. His brain, already damaged by shock and blood loss, clung to life, distorting reality. He saw flashes, the diner, its yellow teeth, his hands clutching the keys to the pickup truck. And then he heard his own voice, not a rasp, but a clear, calm one. He talked with her, repeating her words. "Chaos is the foundation. We are all meat." Evelin stopped, looking at him in surprise. Blood flowed from his shattered head, flooding his eye socket, but he continued to whisper in sync with her movements. She struck again, and this time the skull gave way completely, exposing the gray mass of the brain. But even then, Trevor didn't shut up. His lips trembled, spitting out the words she put into him. "Suffering is liberation." She dropped the hammer and picked up the knife. The last incision was deep, from the throat to the abdomen, opening it up like a carcass in a slaughterhouse. The entrails spilled onto the table, steam rising from the hot blood in the cold warehouse air. Evelin looked at it with satisfaction, but something new flashed in her eyes: anxiety. Trevor was still moving his lips, even when his lungs stopped working. His voice, faint as the whisper of the wind, repeated, "I understand. I understand." She grabbed a saw and began to cut his neck, separating his head from his body. Blood splashed into her face, but she didn't stop until her head hit the floor with a thud. Trevor's lips froze, but his one eye stared at her, frozen in a strange, almost grateful emptiness. Evelin wiped her hands on her pants and took out her notebook. She wrote it all down, his last words, his broken mind, his acceptance of her truth. It wasn't just a story, it was a victory. But when she finished writing, something changed. She looked at Trevor's head lying in a pool of blood, and for the first time in a long time, she felt cold. Not fear, but awareness. She didn't just create a victim, she created a mirror. His words, his look, his agreement with her philosophy, it was not what she expected. She wanted suffering, but she got a disciple who surpassed her even while dying. Evelin threw her notebook on the table and started gathering up her tools. She was working fast, but her hands were shaking. She put knives, a saw, and an awl in a bag, filled the floor with gasoline, and set it on fire. The fire broke out, devouring Trevor's body, his head, and photographs of her past victims. She left the warehouse without looking back until the flames lit up the night behind her. The next day, she returned to the diner as if nothing had happened. The visitors asked for a story again, and she began to tell, about a man who came for the truth and found it in pain. Her voice was steady, but something was breaking inside. She saw Trevor in every trucker, in every curious face. His whisper sounded in her head, "I understand." Evelin continued to live, to carve, to tell. But now she knew that the chaos she loved so much had turned against her. Trevor didn't die completely, he stayed in her mind, like a mental splinter, proving that even meat can think. And it was worse than any death she could have imagined.